This class will be concerned with the Human Relations School. In particular, we're going to focus in on the Hawthorne studies. Now, human relations theory was developed through the Hawthorne experiment. This is a very famous experiment. We should be aware of what it means and how it was conducted and its implications for the way in which we see organisation structures and motivation within organisations. Elton Mayo established the Hawthorne experiment. It lasted from 1927 to 1932 at the Western Electric Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois. The initial concept of the experiment was to show that a greater level of illumination in a working environment improved productivity. So, in fact, the Hawthorne experiment had very limited ambitions to start. It was simply looking at the amount of illumination, the amount of light within the working environment, and the relationship between illumination, between the amount of light in the area in where the work was taking place, and the productivity within that area. So it was trying to work out a correlation, if you like, between illumination and productivity. So very limited objectives associated with the Hawthorne study. Just simply looking at illumination versus productivity. The research carried out suggested that improved light levels increased productivity levels. The research also suggested that productivity increased within the control room. So like a good experiment should be, there was a controlled room where light levels were not varied, and a room where the light levels were varied, and differences between productivity in both were measured to see if there was a statistical difference between them. And this was the case. There was improved productivity when lighting was improved within the working area. This created a new area of study within management theory, as classical theory implies control of employees to increase productivity. So this was new. This set off management thinking in a different way. Up to this point, classical theory was about controlling the workforce, ensuring that the rules were followed, ensuring that targets were met, objectives and goals were set, and it was the workforce who had to be channeled into achieving those. They had to be watched and instructed and almost forced into achieving the targets. However, the Hawthorne study suggested that people would work harder simply by changing the environment, changing the lighting levels where they were working. If the lighting was better, they would work harder. They didn't have to be forced to work harder, they simply worked harder. So this was a departure in thinking within the management literature. It was moving away from forcing the workers to behave in certain ways, more towards enabling them to work better by giving them better conditions, in this case better lighting. The findings of the human relations theory implies that productivity increased because employees were being observed and felt like an important part of the research. So perhaps it wasn't the light itself that was causing the increased productivity. Perhaps it was a feeling amongst the workers that they were being observed and therefore they were important. And because they felt important, they were working harder and applying themselves more diligently to the task. So they felt that they were the subject matter of this experiment, if you like, this subject matter of this observation, and that they were therefore important and would work harder as a consequence. Mayo extended the research by looking into the effects of fatigue and boredom on productivity, and how these factors could be controlled through rest breaks, work hours, temperature and humidity. So Mayo went on not just to look at the illumination within the department, but also looking at fatigue. People get tired over the day, and how does that affect productivity? And boredom. If they're doing the same task day in, day out, if they're doing the same task repetitively, do they get bored? And if they get bored, what happens to productivity? Mayo separated 6 female workers from the assembly line and supervised them. They were working under friendly conditions. Their aim was to assemble telephone relays. So he took out 6 female workers from the assembly line and supervised them. Now they were working under very friendly conditions, and their aim was to assemble telephone relays. Mayo occasionally made changes to working conditions, letting the workers know in advance that he was going to do so. So there were no surprises for the workers. He told them from time to time he was going to change something, and then he would change it and make more observations. There was an observer always present to take note of the working environment. So everything was recorded. This was a proper experiment. Notes were recorded on what was happening, what was proposed, timings were taken, and accurate accounts were taken by an observer. Now the conditions and the results. Well, under normal conditions, 48 hours a week, that was the working hours back then, including Saturdays, so it was a 6-day week, and there were no rest periods throughout the day. The workers worked continuously. The female staff produced 2,400 relays a week each. So working under these conditions, that's what the female staff could produce. They were then put on piecework for 8 weeks, paid for every item they produced. So they were put on piecework for 8 weeks, given a sum of money for each one that they produced. This meant output, or this led to output going up. Output went up as a consequence of the introduction of piecework. This may have got over the problem of boredom, or lack of productivity, or lack of application, or it meant they were more interested in producing more because they got more. Then he introduced 2 5-minute rest periods, including a morning and afternoon, and this lasted for 5 weeks, just to observe what would happen to productivity. So he got the workers to stop work at a particular time in the morning, have 5 minutes break, sit down, rest. He did the same in the afternoon. Output went up. The rest periods were extended to 10 minutes. 5 minutes was the bare minimum. It just sort of suggested what was going on, so it went up to 10 minutes. And then output went up considerably, because now the workers were refreshed, they were relaxed. It's tiring standing all day working on something. When they had a rest period, they could sit down and relax and socialize. They could talk to each other and get to know each other better. So output went up. When they went back to work, they worked harder. A 6 5-minute break period was introduced. This meant output fell slightly. When this led, I should say, to output falling slightly. The observations indicated that the 6 5-minute break was not a success in terms of productivity. Return to 2 rest periods. One hot meal was also supplied by the company free of charge. Output went up. The workers felt the respect of the company and felt valued by the company. They had rest periods. Now they had a hot meal in midday. The female staff were dismissed at 4:30 p.m. rather than the usual 5 p.m. shift. Again, output went up. When they were dismissed at 4 p.m., output was the same. When the female staff went back to their normal working conditions, output was higher than previously recorded at 3,000 relays a week. Previously, if you remember back in the slides, it was 2,400. Now it had gone up to 3,000 and had stabilized at 3,000, even though the working conditions had gone back to what they were right at the start. So Mayo discovered that production increased despite any changes he made. Output had gone up and they didn't seem linked to what he had done. Productivity still increased even though Mayo cut out breaks and the women had to work longer hours. Productivity had still gone up. The women had formed a social environment at the workplace. That's the difference. The rest periods that he had introduced and the better working conditions he had introduced had enabled the workers to get to know each other, and they had formed social relationships within the work environment. They got to know each other. So it was a better place to work. Previously, they'd been working so hard they didn't really get to know each other. He discovered that employees are motivated by much more than economic self-interest. So he came to the conclusion that it wasn't just economics that drove the workers. The piece rates, for example, indicated an increase in productivity, then the break periods and so on. He discovered that by analysing this, that there was something else driving the workers other than money, other than economic self-interest. Women raised their self-esteem when they felt like a part of a team, were allowed to have a friendly relationship with their supervisors, with each other and with the supervisors. So it wasn't so much a distinction between them and us. It wasn't a distinction between management and workers. That was blurred. And that meant that the female staff felt more involved in the work processes, and they raised their productivity as a consequence. He had gained their respect, loyalty and cooperation, which explains the increase in productivity despite reducing rest breaks. So people were working for money. They needed to have that to maintain themselves and their families. But their productivity seemed to be linked to the social environment within the workplace. And the break periods that he'd given them and the changes he had made had simply allowed them to get to know each other. They started to work in a different way. And the interaction between them and the better relationships between them and their supervisors led to this increased productivity. The studies had positive effects. Having concern and care for employees gave them a sense of belonging and that they are a part of the team. This introduced the concept of the Hawthorne Effect, as it's called. The workers felt more involved, more respected. They were a part of a team. They had a sense of belonging. They identified with the organisation. They worked harder. They were more productive. They were happier. So it wasn't the remuneration that was an issue, or it wasn't, in a sense, the conditions of work. It was their ability to mix with each other and talk to each other and get to know each other. That was the important part. And that's what led to the increase in productivity. Now, the conclusions on job performance. Well, the capability of employees the capability of employees is probably the best way of putting it. These are imperfect predictors of job performance. The capacity of the employees it's difficult to work out the capacity, and it, their ability to do certain tasks is not a predictor of what they will do. They may be able to work harder. It's just they're not engaged. So the workers need to be understood as much more complex than was suggested by the classical theorist, who simply saw control of the workers as fundamental in getting the job done. In fact, the job was done, but it could be done more efficiently and with greater productivity if there was a different approach. That's what the Hawthorne experiment showed. It showed that by allowing the female workers to get to know each other and to get to know their supervisors, there was more productivity as a consequence. Informal organizations affect the performance of productivity. Informal organizations is simply when people talk to each other. They might talk about anything, about sport or fashion or family or whatever it is. They might talk about all sorts of issues. They get to know each other, and at the same time they're working, and at the same time they are happier. And being happier and having friends in the workplace, having colleagues and associates in the workplace, they felt engaged, and their productivity went up as a consequence. Establishing norms amongst groups affect productivity. The workers should understand what the organization expects of them, but the expectation should be realistic and almost pitched at a level which enables the workers to overachieve, which gives them a sense of pride and commitment, and they should be rewarded and praised for their efforts. So establishing norms is a good idea because it gives a benchmark for the employees to aim at. But they're working as a part of a team. They feel more involved, they feel more engaged, and they will have much more application as a consequence. The work environment is a social system and plays an important part in production. The social system is important. That's where people meet. And because people congregate in work, they meet in work, it is a social system. And they have to link to each other, they have to talk to each other. They may talk more formally about the job and the requirements and passing work from one person to the next. But if given the opportunity to get to know each other, they may be more supportive of each other and help each other more, and as a consequence productivity rises. Now the advantages, led to the development of action research. The Hawthorne study led to the whole idea of action research. Having informal groups allows more control over employees because the management now knows who's mixing with who and who wants to work with whom, and so it's better in the formation of teams. Teams are almost self-selecting. The management see who can work best with who else, and form teams accordingly. So there's a much better outcome as a consequence. The workers are happier to work with people they select, if possible, and will be more productive. The experiment showed that organizations are not just technical economic systems, but they're social systems. So productivity was linked to interaction, informal interaction between, back with the Hawthorne experiment, between the female workers who were being observed, and productivity went up significantly. Mayo only focuses on motivation as a disadvantage from informal groups, does not consider learning, capability and reflection aspects. So the study was quite limited, but nonetheless it's felt to have given a good insight into motivation in the workplace. So it could be criticised as limited, and perhaps a more extensive study could have been conducted looking at all sorts of issues, for example learning capabilities and so on. But despite all of that, as I said, it does give us an insight, and for that reason alone it's worth studying. Empirical proof for the Hawthorne effect was said to be weak. Well, empirical proof, it's very difficult to prove anything. Famous writers in the area of methodology suggest that all we can do is disprove ideas. So we can't really prove what is it determines motivation precisely. We can find instances where productivity is increased and better working relationships are established, but these may not be replicated elsewhere. Other parts of industry may find that other circumstances dominate there. So it may be unfair to criticize the Hawthorne experiments in this way, because it was a very early experiment. It was limited, but it did give a good insight into human involvement in the workplace. And it did suggest that companies were not just economic centres dedicated to technical efficiency and measurement and so on, that they were in fact social centres, and productivity was a function of that social interaction, as well as remuneration, respect and so on. So this is an important topic, and it's one that you should pay careful attention to and do some more reading and research in the area. It's certainly one of the big ideas and one of the big areas of study within motivation and within organizational studies. But let's leave it at that for the moment and say thank you for watching.